Welcome to the Christian Romance Podcast, where we go behind the books with inspiring Christian romance authors, exploring faith, love, and the journey that brings the story to life. I'm your host, Kelly Jo Wilson, and today we're chatting with Dan Walsh. Dan is the best-selling author of 29 faith-based novels, including The Unfinished Gift and The Reunion, both soon to be adapted into films. With over 1.8 million copies sold and multiple Carol and Selah awards, his books are known for their rich, character-driven storytelling and page-turning suspense. Writing full-time since 2010, Dan lives in the Daytona Beach area with his wife, Cindy. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode so you can hear more about our newest book giveaway. Now, here's my conversation with Dan. Hi, Dan. I am so happy to have you on the Christian Romance Podcast today. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks, Kelly, for the invitation. Really look forward to this, and glad I'm healthy enough to finally do it after a couple of times we tried. But yeah, we're looking forward to getting some time with you and your listeners.
Absolutely, yes. I cannot wait for our listeners to hear more about your journey. You have come down a very interesting path on how you have become an author, and you have so much experience. And why don't you just share how you got started, how your love for reading and writing came about, and how you got started as being first a traditionally published author and then taking that into being independently published and reaching and connecting with your readers, and even how your faith journey looked in that.
Sure. Well, I actually would say my journey began in 11th grade. Um, and it happened because I thought when I was younger, I wanted to be an astronaut and
Mm.
have like a engineering type background and all that because the space program was so huge when I was a kid. And then I ran into the problem, which is I wasn't very good at math and chemistry. Chemistry, I got a D, and I was so in 11th grade, just so, okay, just like a door slamming. I can't go any further. And just so happened that I wound up taking an elective because I had some gaps now in my senior year, and that one of them was creative writing, which I just took it thinking it would be easy. It wasn't like I was prior to that had all this experience, and everybody said, "Oh, you write so well." I took this course, and it kind of lit up something in me. And the short version is I everything I wrote and turned in, I got like A plus plus. And the teacher was just at different times kind of embarrassing, but she'd read what I wrote to the class. And at the end of the leading of the summer, she kind of pulled me aside and she said, I don't say this easily or often, but she said, you might be one of the most gifted writers I've ever taught. And she said, you actually could have a career in this if you really were to work at it. And so I was like,
Wow,
pretty excited about that.
yes.
And of course, after just realizing my whole door shut on being the astronaut, uh, now I'm thinking maybe it's this. And so I just began all my senior year. I was just writing short stories and poems, and pretty much only showing them to my mom because if I was running with the cool crowd. I was a surfer, and I was like, if my friends caught hold of this, I'd be in trouble. But towards the end of the senior year, some of them were aware of it, and of course, you know, then this happened. I wound up getting, I would say, radically converted in the middle of my senior year, and I just started reading the Bible just with an appetite that wouldn't stop. And the more I read, the more I realized this is what I need to know the Lord.
Mm.
All the ambitions I had, or whatever, just kind of fell by the wayside. And the thing I wanted most was to know the Lord and understand. So I just became just a student of the Bible, and again, trying to not get into too much of the weeds here, but I got married. I met, it would be wrong to say a high school sweetheart because I met her the summer after high school, but we just fell in love and were engaged for a year. And at 19, we married. And probably within the first year of our marriage, I had what people would commonly call a call to ministry experience, where I really
Mm.
believed I heard from the Lord that this is what I was supposed to do, was to be a pastor teacher, and spent the next years of my life pursuing that. And at 28, became it was crazy to call me senior pastor at 28, but that was the title they gave the lead pastor of this church that we launched. And for the next 25 years, I was the senior pastor of this church that we started. Uh, and around, but so pretty much the fiction fell by the wayside. I always never felt, like obviously I had so much to do, and as a pastor, writing wasn't going to be a realistic thing. I never lost my love of reading fiction, so just to relax, I always read fiction. And in my back of my mind, I thought maybe someday, maybe when I retire, the Lord will let me do this again, go back to that writing that I was doing that one senior year in high school. Well, what happened was probably at year 22, 23 of the pastor, I was starting to experience some serious burnout symptoms. And we wound up discussing, my wife and I, about, what I could do to help. And she suggested, she remembered way back when, how much I used to love to write. And she said, why don't you do that? Kind of like how Churchill would paint to relax. I wasn't thinking anything would come of it. So over that holiday, I got the idea for what became The Unfinished Gift, started writing it in my spare time, uh, really like, an hour or two, a night. And then on my day off, I maybe 4 or 5 hours, and I would read it to my wife, and she loved it. And well, maybe over that year, I finished it, and we gave it to some ladies in the church that read fiction just to see what they thought. And they were like, "Oh my gosh, this is really good. You should get this published." And back then I didn't realize until, of course, I'm a pastor. I don't know anything about publishing, and I find out how really hard it is to get published. And it felt like to me like an impossible mountain. But the one suggestion was you really need to find a good agent, and if you can get a good agent, they will shop the books to the publisher. And so that's what I made I cleaned up the book as best I knew how, found out about how to write query letters and how to approach agents. And I found out who were the best agents in Christian fiction were at that time. I thought, well, I'll start with them, and they'll reject me, and I'll go through that list, and then I'll get with the B-listers and the C-listers, and maybe somebody will take me. Well, what happened was the first three I submitted to, two of those three got back to me within 2 weeks saying, I love this. Well, I want to read the whole book. And to show you how this was 2008. One of them wanted me to send the book in a printed in a box, like the old-fashioned way, mail the manuscript. The other one, AOL, had come out. It was a little telephone modem. Remember, you got mail, and so she said, "I don't want to wait for that. I want you to send it to me over AOL." And so it took almost like 4 hours for the one file to. I watched this blue bar all night, kept checking it to make its way, and she read it the next day. She stopped and she called me at the end of the day, and she said, "I can sell this. Please don't sign with anyone else." And I'm just like floored. I'm expecting this horrible, long-term journey of a drawer full of rejection letters. And next thing you know, I signed with her, and 6 weeks later, she had to deal with a major publisher. The next Christmas, I'm seeing there's this hardback book with my name on it at Barnes and Noble. And after it came out, it won 2 national awards, the Carroll Award for Best Debut Author and Best Historical Novel. And that kind of just launched things. My publisher was coming back saying, "What else you got?" And I'm like, "I don't have anything else. This is the book. This is the book that I could say I wrote a book, And she said, "No, you can't write books like this and not have more books." And so my wife and I kind of banged our heads together and thought, at the tail end of that book, we thought there was a love story that had a chance to happen. And so we worked it out. I told them, they said, "Start writing it." So I got about 75 pages into it. They read it and they bought it. And so I read that, finished that book. And when that book came out, that's when people were just like this. They started comparing me to Nicholas Sparks, and my editors and publisher, they kind of decided that's the brand. We want you to be the Nicholas Sparks of Christian fiction. And so for the next, a total of a dozen books with them through 2014, I was able to go full time. They offered me enough money and enough contracts, so I was able to start writing full time at 2010. And, I loved it. I loved writing those kinds of books. And, but at the same time, as I mentioned to you all before we started, that happened to be the time when there was like this major upheaval, like a tsunami had hit publishing called Amazon. And the whole world was changing and rapidly. And before, from 2009 to 2014, I had lots of my author friends, bestsellers. The publishers had gone belly up. Some had, halfway through a series, got canceled. And so I had, been praying. We'd been praying that because I still was doing good, but I felt like I could see, the clouds on the horizon. So we prayed about it, and my publisher kind of made it easy for me because when it came time to renew, they weren't too excited about the books I was pitching to them, which was the first time after 12 books. And we prayed about it and decided, I think this is the Lord opening the door saying, go go on your own to do it. Don't write these books that you believe in, and don't worry about the money. And so that's what we did. And I wrote in 2015. I came out with When Night Comes, my first suspense novel out of 13. His first one was a suspense novel, and the other one called Rescuing Finley, which was very much in keeping with my Nicholas Sparks type books. And they did really, really well, more than I could have expected. Uh, and so I started over the next several years, just wrote the following, you know, and so I wound up with, both of those books have 4 book series, and they've done, I mean, really, both those books sold way better than my Revell books, way better.
Mm.
And the other thought was is economically, we were doing much better financially. So it just was kind of like it seemed like the die was set. This is the path. I'm just going to keep doing this. And now, thankfully, we're getting ready to start book number 30. So,
It's wonderful.
uh,
It
yep.
is wonderful. I'm so excited for you, Dan, because that is such a wonderful, interesting journey because you're just trying to be obedient and follow your call. Like you said, you got the call to ministry. And I feel like, has anybody ever said this to you that I feel like maybe writing for you was your unfinished gift and God called you right back into it to do it again and to continue. And it's funny that your breakout book is called The Unfinished Gift because you had this wonderful gift that this teacher was telling you could do something with. So God was like, giving you the desire of your heart. And I love whenever he does that.
And to me, it's like I've never, in all this time, I have never experienced what people would call writer's block. If anything,
Mm.
I'm that's why I'm saying when I finished that unfinished gift, I had no books in mind. When I finished the second book, I had no books in mind. And if you'd have told me then you're going to be writing book number 30, 20, I was like, hard to fathom. But it's almost like a fountain, So like the Lord's, uh, I keep getting ideas. Just got a fairly new idea I'm talking with my son about today, and he's thinking that needs to be your next book, Dad. So we'll see, but
That's
very, very
exciting.
grateful.
And that it is remarkable because it is the difference in this kind of writing, right? When you're writing books with a clear Christian message or a message of hope, even sometimes like, even if it's covert, it's not very overt in the books, but whenever you're writing these books and co-creating with God, it is different. He does give you that kind of endless fountain. And it's funny because when we were talking earlier, when you were had mentioned about sometimes like you weren't sure like where the book was coming from or like you didn't know like what I have experienced that too. And I feel like, and I've talked to many authors that have experienced that sometimes or actually whenever you were saying like this confidence, it's hard to have confidence even no matter where you're at in the journey. Sometimes it's a struggle because I feel like sometimes when you start a new story or a new book, it's like you're at square one. Is it like that for you a little bit? Because, with this journey, God is teaching you something new each time, whether it's about yourself or through your characters, or does it feel like that for you?
I think that probably what I do, my process, because obviously having those earlier books having such success,
Hmm.
and it wasn't anticipated. It wasn't like, oh yeah, this is going to go great. I mean, I was like surprised as anyone, the level of success. But what it taught me was, okay, what I did here unintentionally is the right process for me. And so I kind of like dissected like I can reproduce this if I stay faithful to the process that got me here, rather than So I realized part of my I didn't get there by imitating a bunch of other people. It was like this was the thing that I did, kind of organically, I guess. And so part of it was for me. The first part of it, and when I write a book, is when I get the germ of the idea, I develop this. I could call it the storytelling phase. I don't just launch into writing. Some people just write. I actually spend time cultivating the story
Mm.
and sort of seeping like a tea bag. Just I want and trying to get a sense of, and so I really sense of I have the beginning and also the end, and hopefully, and I'll spend maybe weeks just just absorbing if it's a time period or if it's something happening with all that, so I feel like kind of like an actor getting a character, I guess, maybe what I say.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't write. I maybe make jot down notes, but I come to a point where I feel like now I'm ready to write. And then I start to write using this like 5-page rough synopsis. But the one thing that's always been true for me, and it turns out to be one of the strengths, I guess, judging by the reviews, is that I understood how important the characters were
Mm.
to the story. It's not just the story or the tension or the plot. The characters are almost paramount to readers, and because they are to me too. And so once the characters become real to me, I almost felt like a scribe when I write. Here's like, what are we going to write today? Well, here are the characters, and this is, and I wonder what. And so they'll start the scene, and I'm actually like listening to them, and and it's going on in my head, but I'm like, there are times, numerous times when what I end up with at the end of the day, the chapter wasn't at all what I expected, because these characters like. So I never forced the characters to say or do anything that they wouldn't say or do as people. It's not like, oh, the plot says I have to wind up here, so I got to make these guys get here. It's like, no, that that here might be 3 chapters away because these guys are real, and wherever they take the story, we're going to follow. And I let they call it character driven. There's a term for it now, but back then it was just how I wrote. And for me, it makes it really exciting because it is something of an adventure. I'm kind of going through this. I know where we need to end up, but I haven't pegged everything. And so it's kind of a fun experience, really. And my wife, when I read it to her, I would read to her every couple of chapters, and she would just be like on the edge of her seat, like she's like, "You got to keep back to writing," and it was that way for me too. So it makes it kind of fun. And so I guess in some ways, that process seems to be, judging by the majority of the reviews that I get, seems to be really connecting with people. Like they like that. I like it as a writer, and they like it as readers. So it seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, that's exciting. I love to hear that you say like you can see the characters. It's almost like you're watching the movie. You're watching them in their own life, like in a movie. That's exactly what happens with me too. I focus very much on the characters as well. And it's
Right.
funny that you say you're like a scribe because that's how I'll feel sometimes too. And I feel like you explained that so well. When I try to explain it to my family, it's like I'm a little bit crazy, little bit, because I'll be like, "Oh no, Cole didn't say that." And they're like, "What?" You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
I
saying your
remember
characters like they're real people in real life. So I love how
the
you
first time
explain that. That's very amazing.
the first time I became aware of it, I think I was writing the book called The Discovery, which is, I think, book number 5. And there was this really tense scene where this father and mother had just discovered the daughter that is engaged to a guy that they've just discovered is actually uh, a Nazi spy. And it's just like the whole thing's got to shake up completely. And so I'm like, I know they have to have this confrontation, and I'm as nervous as they are and I'm writing this thing, and then the father and the mother are talking to the daughter, and I had in my mind what was going to happen, and then the father started saying things to the daughter that made me cry.
Oh
I was
yeah.
like, I could not believe that's what he said. I typed it down, and then I looked at the. It's almost like I was like, I looked at the daughter. It's like, what's she going to say to that? I honestly didn't know. And then I heard what she said. It was like, oh my! And the whole scene was almost like at the end of it, I was just exhausted. But I realized I don't know. That to me, some of the best scenes. It turns out are those kinds of scenes. So I would
Oh
say if you're
yeah.
already seeing that, just let it, go with it because I think that really resonates with people.
Oh
Them being
yeah,
plot
for
driven.
sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because we wanna live vicariously through the characters, right? We wanna really
Yep.
have characters that we're rooting for in the book and have that emotional connection. I feel like as an author, that's your role. That's the highest honor you can have is really creating these characters or like fostering these characters so that people can have that emotional connection. And if there's no connection in you, there's likely not going to be that strong of a connection in your reader. So I,
Right.
yes, definitely have spent times crying while writing. I can tell you that. Even short stories, even short little devotionals, I have as well, and I think that that's wonderful. And I love that you embrace it, and I'm sure your readers do too. And this is why you get such great feedback from this, and you have people loving these stories, and of course, because of Cindy, we love Cindy, who is
Right.
your wonderful muse of 48 years, and who has helped you create these beautiful tales and these beautiful stories that you connect with people. Why don't you talk a little bit too about, so you were saying about the unfinished gift, and then so that book, as well as another one of your books called The Reunion, are in production for film. So for our
Right.
listeners that are big fans of yours, why don't you talk a little bit about that and kind of that process? Not maybe not like the whole process, if you're not sure where it ends up. I know sometimes it can get a little bit um detailed and whatnot with films, but why don't you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. My the first book that was came into the focus as far as possibly being a movie was The Reunion, which was my fifth book, I think, or sixth book. I can't remember. But uh, two Hollywood producers that I didn't know them at all when this started. My act turned out my church secretary for 14 years of those 25 years. Her godson was a Hollywood producer, and he'd been involved in like 20 different
Oh.
major pictures out in L. And so she talked to him every month. They just talked on the phone, and he was talking to her about they get together with a bunch of conservative believers out there. It's really kind of a wasteland for them in some ways. Uh, finding like-minded people. So they would get together for lunch. And at that time, I think the movie God's Not Dead had just come out and did
Mm,
really well, just surprised everyone at the box office. And it got them to thinking that maybe the faith-based movies could be done well and actually make money and not be.
mm,
And so they kind of decided that they wanted to make a faith-based movie. They were both getting older now in their late 50s. And before their life was over, they wanted to start making some movies that mattered. So uh, he was just telling her that, and she said, "Well, my pastor has written these crazy good books. You should read them." And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, sure." And she says, "No, promise me you'll read." And she sent him two books, The Unfinished Gift and Reunion. And he read The Unfinished Gift first, and didn't even read The Reunion. And he was like, "Oh my!" Well, he read The Reunion first, not The Unfinished Gift. And he's like, "This might be the best book I've read in years." And he
mm.
gave it to the other guy, and that guy read it, and he's crying at the end. They're both crying at the end. They're like, "This is an amazing book." They came back to lunch. This is the book we're going to do the movie. And so they contacted me, asking me was it available. I mean, is it available? Of course, it's available. you know. And they were like, yeah. And so they started the process then. And then Nick, the guy who was writing it, just so happened that another story he'd written called Green Book had gotten picked up by a couple other guys, and then it wound up steamrolling into a major motion picture with, I think it was Universal, but they wound up that year. I think it was 2018. It won Golden Globes and Oscars for Best Picture and Best Screenplay.
Mm.
And so that just took this a whole different thing. Was now Nick was like all kinds of opportunities and situations and they kind of decided let's put the reunion on hold for a little bit to let this happen because it can only help us later. And then COVID hit. And COVID was like a 2-year nightmare for the movie industry. Everything went crashing down. And in the middle of that particular story got stuck in some legal quagmire. And even when COVID cleared up, they couldn't free it for a while. And so I kind of had given up for it being made. I really felt like maybe. So meanwhile, my son decides he wants to make movies for his career, and he created. He's on. This will be his third film of Unfinished Gift, but he made two other films that are on streaming. They're not faith-based films, but he decided with his friends. I think it was a year ago Thanksgiving, that holiday season, they had realized that your dad's this crazy big author, and he said, well, he sent them The Unfinished Gift. He said, read this book, tell me what you think. And they were like, both of them were like, one was the producer and one was the cinematographer. He would be the writer director in that team.
Mm.
And they were like, Isaac, why are we doing anything else? this is like a classic story. This is like a Dickens story. What do I? And so they talked to me like, would you give us permission to turn this into a movie? I'm like, I'd love it. Nothing
Mm.
would make me happier. So they started the process, and right now they're well underway. I mean, they're actually the script is finished. He wrote this beautiful script. Really loved it. Um, and Kappa Studios, probably haven't heard of them, but you've probably heard of The Chosen. You know that
Oh,
series that's very
absolutely.
popular.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah, well, Kappa Studios does all the post production for The Chosen. They saw and read the book and they loved it, and they actually created a 14-minute radio pitch at their expense to help promote this thing and help us get this thing
Oh,
made. We're regularly talking with them, so it's going out this week. The scripts are going out this week. We had to wait because of the fires, that happened in
oh,
L.A.
yeah.
So many of the
Yeah.
people are involved that we would be contacting with during that middle of that. So, but it's very possibly they're going to start shooting the unfinished gift over the summer, and it may
That's
actually
amazing.
get to the finish line before the reunion. But then when I thought all was lost for the reunion, the producers of the Reagan movie, that was a hit movie about President Reagan, came out August and September. They loved the reunion story, so they contacted me and they bought the rights to it. And they said, we're
Oh,
going to make this movie very soon. It might not be in 2025, it might be 26, but we're committed. And they signed the contracts and the papers, and so if I felt once again like Lord's opened the door where maybe both of them are going to get made,
that's
that would be
amazing,
pretty
Dan.
exciting.
I'm so excited for you. I am so excited and I cannot wait until these come out. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And just like you said, how the Lord has opened these doors for you. I was going to say that it seems like now it seems like there's more of a hunger for these faith-based films,
I agree.
especially in the Chosen's wake, right? Like through Angel
Yeah,
Studios and I love that so much because people are having this wonderful response, and the word and Jesus and is just becoming not so like hush hush anymore. Like people don't
right,
feel as, I don't know if it's like shameful to talk about, or it's more prevalent, and it's really showing how much people really just need him. They need more of him and they crave him,
right,
especially in stories, just whether through books, through films, through movies, through shows. And it just is makes this and like this podcast and writing and your writing and through your books too, just all that more special and important. And I love to see how God brings that to people. I just think it's wonderful, because you never know. I mean, uh, somebody, especially with the unfinished gift. I mean, what if they see the movie, then they read about it? You never know if they, can come to faith and maybe learn, because I feel like, and we talk about that a lot on this podcast, that it's not so easy for people who have been really hurt or traumatized or broken or feel like they're not worthy to pick up a Bible. A lot of times people just don't they're not going to go there first. Um, if Jesus is knocking on their door, maybe, but sometimes they won't. It breaks down a little bit of a barrier to watch a movie or to read a book, read a fiction book, and then maybe, some of those seeds start getting planted. So
yeah.
I absolutely love that. I love what you do. I'm so excited for you and for the movies to come out. I know we are almost at time, but I did want to ask you. So you have this. So I wanted to give you some time to talk about your most recent book that has come out. I know it came out a few months ago, but The Perfect Stranger. So in why don't you talk a little bit about that? And of course, we love the love stories. This is why we gotta again, we have to give Cindy kudos for you and her and your
Yeah.
beautiful love story for, meeting so young and being together for 48 years. I love it. But why don't you talk a little bit about the story of The Perfect Stranger and the love story in that? And then also a little bit about the theme that we were chatting about earlier.
Sure. Well, the when I was with my publisher, those first dozen books with Ravel, once they had decided they wanted my quote brand to be somewhat of a Nicholas Sparks type theme, one of the things that they had said back then was he didn't typically write historical fiction, before like earlier than World War II. So
Mm.
they said we really would like you to stay. World War II or sooner. And I thought, because I had this story idea that turned out to be the one, Perfect Stranger, back then. And I pitched it to them, and that's when they said, "Well, we love the story, but we really like you to stay from the 1940s onward." And this was set in 1912.
Mm.
So when I finished the two books I wrote last year, and it was time to think about what I'm going to write next, I was praying about it, and I just remembered that story. It just kind of popped into my head. I had to go really dig back in the files to find it, because it was in a folder, but it was a folder of books that I liked they rejected. And so I picked it out, and I read the synopsis, and I thought, yeah, I'd love to write that, and there's nobody to stop me. It's all up to me. Do I want? And I had this, I thought, yeah. So I started developing it, and I read it to Cindy, and she said, "Oh yeah, I remember you talking about that one. Yeah, you should write it." So, and it does. It's a story. It's a standalone, right? I don't know if I'll write a sequel to it later. We'll see. But right now, it's just a love story standalone. It's set in the month before the Titanic sinks. The Titanic is in the backdrop. It's not about the Titanic, but it gives you a good anchor as far as the time, because a lot of people are aware of what was going on in terms of Titanic. So that's the time frame, and it's called The Perfect Stranger. Try not to give too much away here, but
Yes, no spoilers.
the idea is the young lady who's she's part of it's set in New York during the Gilded Age, and she's part of that crowd. Her parents are wealthy, but they're very committed church goers. And she's very wealthy. Also, she volunteers 3 times a week at a charity thing the church has for the poor. And in that setting, she winds up meeting this handsome young man who comes from another church to deliver stuff, to their church. And one thing leads to another. And so, of course, the problem is that's an era when people married with families. It was very important who connected you were, kind of like the Jane Austen look of things. And he's not coming from a good family. We don't know any of his background, but he seems to be a wonderful guy. He seems to have, everything. And so the father gives us permission, after getting to know him, that to court his daughter, not aware of his, there's anything that, and things start to unravel really from the first chapter. This beautiful, what appears to be a beautiful love story, goes very sour, and it gets in as time goes by, it gets really, really more intense, and eventually it seems like someone's trying to tear them apart. And but obviously, I keep writing till things get better. I don't ever. I'm not a believer in leaving people. Life is hard. If I'm making stuff up, I'm not going to have a sad ending. So we keep writing till things get better. So it ends up in a really satisfying way, I think. Judging by, again, the reviews, I'm in Florida. It's been out for 10 weeks, and there's over 500 reviews, mostly 5-star. And so, again, I just mentioned how you're always a little nervous. Will they like this one? Is this the one that they're going to be in? So the reception's been wonderful. So I've been very grateful for that.
That's wonderful. And it sounds like such an interesting time. I feel like that time frame around the Titanic, it was such a like booming, like there was like industrial revolution was kind of
Yeah,
around there, and it was just, this massive ship is created, and it's so like intriguing to people, and just the stories even surrounding the Titanic,
it was so fun to research. I mean, the one nice thing
oh, I'm
about that era,
sure.
so much. There's even videos. There's even videos. It's not just reading about it, like Civil War. You actually have videos of that era, colorized and all kinds of stuff. Because the Titanic was such a phenomenal story. There's all kinds of stuff that you can get to dig into, and then the details are set in New York, and lots of. I mean, I'll spare you some of the details, but I mean, it's fascinating detail. Like, I'll just say one, for example. You see these videos, these old timey cars riding down the road, right? And you see these horse drawn carriages in the same street, and then in the middle of that, you see a guy walking in the middle of the road, and you're thinking, you think of New York now, and it turned out the speed limit for the cars then was 8 miles an hour. So I thought, well, that makes sense. Yeah, and they had no traffic lights. There was no traffic lights. No one thought to need them. There's so many things like that. And the other thing, one of the biggest in the Manhattan, in the southern part, it's more like where all the big buildings are now. That was
Mhm.
where the poorer areas were. And the worst part of
Huh.
that for the whole city was in articles in the newspaper was the smell in that section of
Mm.
Manhattan was just almost unbearable. You think of paper mill, driving through a paper mill town, if you ever had that experience, but it really stunk badly. And the people who lived up in the more wealthier areas, that's one of the things they had to benefit. They go out on their porch and it didn't smell bad. I never even thought of things like that. You're reading these
Yeah.
articles about what kind of stuff were these people dealing with day to day. It was so much fun to uncover what their lives are like.
That's really cool. I love that you shared. I love the fun facts, like as they're like the 8 mile an hour. I love that you shared that because that's always fun to hear about, especially because you're doing this research, like you said, especially immersing yourself in that story world before you actually sit down. And in the midst of it, you're finding all these neat tidbits, of things
Right.
that it's like so amazing. I think I read something about that. Lower Manhattan was very there was a lot of because of the way the sewage system ran, or
Yeah.
there was like old sewer kind of things, or there was like an old
And
lake
coal dust
that
was
was.
everywhere. Everything was operated by
Oh
coal.
yeah.
And they said people literally would have just would like volcanic ash, almost just coal dust over everything.
Mm.
And of course, once again, those factories are all in the south. And you further up in Manhattan, you went where Saks Fifth Avenue and Central Park. That was like almost like the country, comparatively. It was beautiful, scenic. You know, it really was another time about have and have nots. Was very 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 big, big gap.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I'm sure that the book is absolutely wonderful. I'll have a link to it in the show notes for sure. Um, Also, before we go, did you want to share a little bit about the theme that you were mentioning? Like how we usually talk about like a Bible verse or a theme kind of related to the book, and you had mentioned something really interesting before we earlier whenever we were chatting earlier. Did you want to just mention that about how it ties to this book too?
Yeah, the theme that comes out in the story, a spiritual theme that comes out more towards about the second half of the book, but it starts being kind of a dominant uh, theme. Because again, these are church folks. These are the whole crowd that in the story, all the characters are church folks, and I would say sincere, the best they knew how, kind of thing. They were sincere, but typical of that era. But even I think even now it can be people would tend to be gossips, and something happening, their tidbit. Well, of course, everyone's first of all wondering should she even be with this fellow who doesn't come from a good family, right? And her family's got stellar pedigree, and they're even dads get even grief because he's allowing it, right? And he's again in his heart he's discerning that this guy is legit, and I don't have to. Well, then some things come out that just completely blow their minds, and
Mm.
it seems like he's not the, I call it the perfect stranger. Maybe this is a disaster, and then once those things happen, it just steamrolls, and everybody in the church is just running with it, and the pastor hates it. The pastor is like trying to stop it. It's like it's avalanche, and I won't give away the details, but thankfully there's a breakthrough where the idea of we really need to, when we don't know what's going on, you know, the Lord just condemns gossip, slander. I mean, really, in scriptures, it's as serious as other sins that we might all agree are sin. But the Bible talks about that how destructive slander is, and how uh, it can ruin hearts, can ruin lives. And this story, of course, almost comes to ruin as a result of that. But like I say, I keep writing till we get to a better place. So, but yeah, I mean, there will be. I think probably if there are some people reading this book who are engaging in that kind of conduct, it's very possible they might hear something from the Lord,
Mm.
about that and how you don't want to be that guy or that gal. When those kind of situations happen, you want to be the person who's believing the best and praying and coming alongside, and you know. So
Oh, yeah. And I think that's such a wonderful thing to highlight because it is so easy, right? I mean, it starts as easy as a genuine concern can turn so fast into a judgment. And I have heard so many times people who don't want to go back to church because of that and who don't want to be part of a community because of that, because of the judgment that falls upon. And in reality, our church community really needs to be the community that rallies around brokenness in all of us, right? Like people who are really needing it.
The Lord drew, he draws near to the brokenhearted. He's, you know,
Mhm.
a smoldering wick he will not put out. A bruised reed he will not. That's the Lord's. That's where the Lord's at. Now, why are we over here with the ones pointing fingers and separating? So I remember hearing this one fascinating story. I mean, I won't get into politics at all, but we all know how politics can be very, very, you know, polarizing. But there was one of the last elections, someone was asking one of these people who do campaigns. Everybody always says they want positive campaigns, but they always turn into negative campaigns and mudslinging. And
Mm,
why do you guys always put up with that? Why do you always run negative ads? And the guy said, I never heard him explain it. He said, the real reason we do this is it's financial. He said, our
mm,
information is that we can, for us to run one negative ad about our opponent, it will be remembered for one ad. For us to get
mm,
something positive about our client, we have to run 6 ads before anyone remembers it.
mm,
And he said, so from a financial standpoint, we just don't have the money to spend those 6 ads for you to believe something good about our guy, and one ad will get you to believe something. And I thought to myself, he doesn't realize it, but he's talking about what the Bible talks about, how we're hardwired for this sin like gossip and slander. We want to. There's something in us that's prone to believe those things about other people. And I thought, yeah, that's true. So
Oh, yeah, for sure. That is very interesting. It almost kind of coincides with this like hardwired negative bias, like you're saying, in which I think was actually in some respects and very little. But I think it was actually kind of a survival mechanism because we years and years ago, like hunter gatherer kind of thing, we would have this like survival to make sure like just the instinct to see like what is going to happen, like the bad things around, or is there danger or anything like that. This like negative bias, like what's the worst possible thing that can happen. But just like with fear, a little bit of fear, reverent fear, is healthy. But just like with fear, it can get like overflowing and just get out of control so fast. And then it turns into like how fear turns into anxiety and panic and this, but then this negative bias just turns into full blown just sin and gossip and worried so much and judgment and all of this, and we're all guilty of it at some point in our lives. And I just love that you are highlighting that, especially with this kind of story. And what a wonderful title too, A Perfect Stranger. I can't wait to read it. It sounds amazing. But yeah, I just think, and especially you being a former pastor, I think that it's probably something you've witnessed so much, and I just appreciate your heart to share it. And even in evidence by your story, right? Like just kind of with your characters and such. So thank you for sharing your heart about that. And just thank you for sharing your heart all together just about your story. And I love that the listeners get a little behind the scenes look at how you came from, right, wanting to be an astronaut to becoming this
right.
best-selling author, award-winning author. I think it's just so exciting. And then possibly your book's being made into movies soon. I can't wait to see that. I'm so excited for you. Why don't
So
you let our listeners and readers know where they can best connect with you?
well, I do have a website, and I'd love for you to come visit it. I don't sell my books on my website; they're all there. You can find out about them. It's just danwalshbooks.com, www.danwalshbooks.com. But what I usually tell people is just go on Amazon and search to say Dan Walsh Books or Dan Walsh Kindle Books, and you'll get tons of 29 books available to they're kind of nice. They actually kind of put them all together where it's easy for you to kind of go through, and if you know how Amazon works, you can just you look at the cover, you read if this is something I like, and you can see the reviews and read some of the reviews if you want. But there's multiple genres. Well, by that I'm not like all over the road. There's definitely about half the books I'd say would be they're like Nicholas Sparks, but I didn't like that comparison because he often has lousy endings, and I I have better endings. I think probably more like I like when people compare me to Charles Martin better. That's a better comparison. So about half my books are in that genre, and then the other half would be like suspense books. That there's going to be a romantic thread in all of them because I'm just that way. But they're not necessarily romance novels. There would be like a real suspenseful story with a romance simmering through it. And sometimes what my goal would be is to take a really challenging thing that might happen in a movie, instead of it being a character that is, a lost person who's just kind of belligerent and, swearing profanity and sleeping around. I'm thinking, what if that same set of circumstances happened to a credible believer?
Hmm.
How would they handle that story? And that's who my characters are in the suspense novels. It's not like they're not reading those to see who's getting saved. It's really, how's this believer handling this crisis, and how's it affecting him and the people around him, and how's he coping with the situation. And it's more, clean read, I guess you'd say, with a Christian worldview. Uh, and
I love that. I think that's so wonderful because believers, we have struggles too, right? It's nice to see
yeah,
characters that have this faith and see how their faith is tested, and it very real life, especially in suspenseful situations where these things absolutely happen, and how can we react to that, and how does this guy, not to mention it makes for a great story. So I love it. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for sharing your heart, like I said, and just thank you so much for sharing a bit about your stories and just being here to chat about The Perfect Stranger and just your journey as a whole. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you, and I just appreciate all the work that you're doing. And thank you so much.
thanks so much, Kelly. I've loved being with you, and look forward to getting together sometime in the future. Maybe when we get more news about the movie or something. So,
Yes, absolutely. You got to come back and tell us about it.
all right.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with one book lover like yourself. We love to bless as many people as we can with exclusive interviews and, of course, great books. Each month, we host a themed book giveaway where you can win a selection of Christian romance novels and some extra goodies, too. This month's theme is International Love. We're giving away 5 heartwarming Christian romance books filled with love, second chances, and faith, set in breathtaking locations like Ireland, Scotland, France, and beyond. Whether you're listening right as this episode comes out or in the future and don't want to miss out on the giveaway, no worries. You'll find the link to the current giveaway on our website, christianromancepodcast.com. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, keep your faith, share the love, and happy reading.